Welcome back to day 3 of Future Proof. We have a great podcast up today, one of my favorites. I love being on it earlier this year. It's the Rational Reminder podcast with Ben Felix, Cameron Passmore, and their guest, Hal Hershfield.
Hey everybody, good morning. Thanks for coming out. Super cool to be here. I want to thank John and the whole team at Advisors Circle for impeccable organization and inviting us. We're super excited to be here. Got a bunch of Canadians. Great to see you all here. Hopefully everybody got their bucket hat. So we're going to try to do a clean recording here with Ben's traditional introduction, as you know. So we're going to do a clean cut. Hopefully it goes clean all the way through. How about we go with that, Ben? You want to start with the intro and then we'll kick it off?
Yeah, sounds good. All right. This is the Rational Reminder podcast, a weekly reality check on sensible investing and financial decision-making from two Canadians. We're hosted by me, Benjamin Felix, and Cameron Passmore, portfolio managers at PWL Capital.
Welcome to episode 273. This is a pretty special event for us. We are live at Future Proof, which is an incredible festival of professionals in the wealth management industry down here in Huntington Beach. It is an unbelievable venue. So we've never done a live recording before in front of an audience. And someone commented on Twitter this morning, Ben, that you and I haven't recorded together since the pandemic, so since March of 2020. Right. As listeners know, we've announced this for a while now. We have a super special guest joining us this morning. Third time guest, Hal.
Yeah, that's right, third time.
So Hal Hershfield is with us. Hal joined us in 256 earlier this summer after his fabulous book, Your Future Self, was released. And he was also here in episode 141.
Yep, so Hal is a professor of marketing, behavioral decision-making, and psychology at UCLA. His research sits at the intersection of psychology and economics and examines the way that we can improve our long-term decisions. Hal's got his PhD from Stanford University. He publishes in all the top academic journals, and he has just written a review paper that I don't think many people have seen.
It was really just the authors and you guys at this point.
Yeah, so we've got some very fresh research that we're going to talk about with Hal today on consumer financial decision making. So with that, I think we can go ahead and start talking about this research. So Hal, in your review paper, how do you define financial decision making?
Yeah, so first off, thanks so much for having me on again. I feel very lucky to be here again.
Well, you're a good friend of the firm.
That's
good friend of
okay.
ours, so it's awesome to have you.
I appreciate
that. And
the
commute wasn't too long.
That's true. So, this is a paper that I wrote with Abby Sussman at Booth and Oded Netzer at Columbia. We were editors on this special issue on consumer financial decision making, which I know sounds super exciting to everybody. But part of the issue, we decided let's write a review paper about financial decision making, and we said, well, we first probably should define what that means, which was a lot harder than we realized going into it. Abby was the one who really kind of nailed down the definition. I think it's something like the accumulation and use of resources over time as reflected in behavior and choices. And that really encompasses a lot there. But the earlier definitions were really broad, didn't really tell you what it was about, and so we had to nail it down to something.
So why is the study of consumer financial decision making important? I mean, this podcast is all about decision making.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, we're preaching to the choir here. I mean, I think you guys know this, but in the academic world, I think people are starting to realize, look, money is at the heart of so many other decisions and so many other outcomes. It touches on so many things. And to be able to understand what are the antecedents of how people make decisions, what are the sort of moderators, what are the influences on them, what are the outcomes, how do people think about these choices and how do they change and how can we change them? I mean, right away you realize how important it is and how crucial it is to know this, not just for the sake of money itself, but for everything else.
So in the paper, you look at kind of where we've been in this field of research and where we're going. Can you talk about the main topics that have been studied?
Sure. So what we did was first gather all the articles we could. We had several research assistants that combed through the journals, and we used we actually used ChatGPT to help us figure out what's actually a financial decision making article, which was hard in itself because we had to define it. It didn't count some of Abby's articles, and then we realized maybe we need to redefine the definition here. But we ran what's called a topic modeling analysis. It's basically using AI to say, okay, what are the different buckets, or machine learning, what are the different buckets here? It comes down to 5 buckets, really. It's saving and spending. It's how do people make trade-offs, right, between money and other things. It also looks at sort of budgeting decisions. We also look at things like negative outcomes, fraud, and economic inequality and whatnot. And then, the final one was really like looking at biases, which of course, is something been studied a lot in behavioral economics.
So what are some of the most interesting findings that you guys came up with?
So, in looking through the papers, look, we've all got our sort of, special preferences here. First, one of the things to note is that there's been so much time spent on saving and spending, and not as much on a lot of these other topics. So, I think academics know a lot about what makes people save or not, but then all these other topics are really kind of open. I'll tell you some of my favorite, like, newer findings from the last couple of years. So, actually, one of the papers that was in this special journal, it's by Scott Rick and Jenny Olson, and it was about financial decision making within couples. I think this is an area that, on the academic side, we study so much of these individual decisions, and yet, and I think everybody in the advisory world knows, rarely are these decisions made as an individual. So one of the things that Scott and Jenny looked at was, what's the interplay, or what matters more for couples' decisions? How much people actually know, or how much people think they know? And it turns out what matters more, if you sort of look at the stats, what actually has a greater impact on decisions is the partner that thinks they know the most. And that may be related to how much they actually know, but it has a unique influence, more so than what they objectively know is what they think they know.
Okay, so you're sitting down with a couple at dinner some night. What would be your advice to them on that specific topic?
No, this is actually a really good question, because part of the big picture here is, well, how do you translate this over? And I think making this explicit, and when I say this, I mean making the conversation about what do you actually know and what do you think you know explicit is important, because it turns out with financial decision making with couples, oftentimes one partner ends up doing the decisions, not because there was an explicit conversation where someone says, I'll do this, but they just start doing it.
So you're basically saying validating if you know what you think you know.
Yeah, I would say like almost auditing it.
Yeah.
To say, look, and look, there are tests you can do this with, but I mean, and this is tricky because you don't want to embarrass somebody. So,
and we're all busy, right? Because so many people, okay, you do finance, I'll take care of something else.
Totally.
So
Absolutely.
tickets done, but you often don't take the time to audit whether you're competent at that.
Absolutely, and you could imagine that you could maximize, you could do better, right? Just because of the status quo or inertia doesn't mean that's how it has to be within a couple.
That is so fascinating.
Yeah. So I think that research. And I should plug it. Scott Rick's got a book coming out in January about financial decision making in couples, and I think that research is just so interesting. Jenny Olson's really one of the forefront of it too. One of the other areas that I'm really interested in is work done by Wendy De La Rosa at Wharton and Steph Tully down at USC. And you know that I really like it if I'm going to plug somebody over at USC, right? Now, she was also my former student. They do great work. One of the things that they've looked at is how payment frequency impacts spending decisions. You think about the model of advising, the model of studying spending, so much of it's based on this antiquated payment system of you get paid monthly or bi-monthly or whatever it may be. And now with so much of a rise of contract workers, and I know that's not necessarily always the people who are getting financial advice, but they make up a huge part of the economy. Now payments are much frequent, and one of the things that they're finding is that people who get paid more frequently spend more frequently, in part, and the sort of mechanism there is that if I get money more often, I feel that money is more certain and I have greater subjective wealth. I think I have more money to spend. And so I spend it more, which can have negative impacts.
That is fascinating. So when you take interesting findings like that, how do you think decision makers or their financial advisors can be using that information to improve their decision quality?
Look, to me, so much of this is about disseminating the research out there on the advisor side. And I know, I'm sure we'll talk about it. There's a difference between disseminating information and actually operating on it, and acting on it. But I think I just spotlighted a couple of findings. There's a lot of other ones I'm happy to go into, but I think, some of this stuff, if you think about acting on it, well, how often do we ask the question of how often are you paid, right? And how often do we ask the question of, right, or subjective perceptions of wealth? Because I think it's really easy to look on paper and look at the numbers and look at the objectives, but what about the subjective side?
That's really interesting. So there's an element of just knowing what questions to be asking clients.
Absolutely, right? I mean, I think what more might you uncover if you start on this sort of subjective side? In addition, I'm not saying replace the standard, objective metrics, but let's add in some subjective parts too.
But can you imagine being paid annually, for example, and having to divvy up your annual salary?
That's wild. I mean, it would be, well, look, you know what? To some extent, when I was a grad student,
you did.
It's sort of, I mean, I think it was like blocked into semesters or quarters, but I had to be really forward thinking because it wasn't that much money to then sort of eke out over the coming months.
Okay, so we're here at Future Proof down in Huntington Beach. There's 3,000 other financial professionals here. This theme of helping people make better decisions and have a better experience is certainly top of mind down here. So where do you think the industry is lagging in this area?
So I have to be careful, right? I don't want to say, like, here's where you're lagging. But, okay, if I were to actually think about that, here, one area where I think industry lags academia is the use of experimentation, right? So academics, I think, really know how to run a randomized controlled trial. They know how to do, what industry calls A/B tests, and how to isolate things and randomize. And the reason that we do that is so that we can get clean insights and know what worked and why it worked. And I totally recognize that sometimes in industry, you don't necessarily need to know why something worked. You just want to know that it works, right? But then there's a downside of not knowing if it really works, but thinking you know that it works just based on intuition, right? And so I think one space where academia can really inform industry is to say, well, how can we go about testing better? And that also is hard sometimes, especially if you have, maybe you have a lot of money under management, but not as many clients, right? And so it's hard to do clean tests with not a lot of people. And also sometimes we may not want to test because there's some risk involved there, but it's short-term risk for long-term gain.
So what kind of tests might we do?
Yeah, you're supposed to figure that out, Cameron. No, I mean, look, this is where the way I see things, every aspect is testable. Down from maybe on the most surface level, the marketing angle, and even there, I would say, let's move away from the one size fits all, but pay attention to nuance, like what messages work better for different clients across the lifespan and so on. But then also, could you play around with the way you bring up certain topics? Is there one way to approach a topic and another way, and let's see what works better? And also, by the way, this is where I'm coming at it, observing the industry but not being in it. And so if you all say to me, well, nice idea, but it's not going to work, that's fine. I'll take that criticism. But I'd love to see more of that actually happen at firms. And maybe some firms are doing that.
So you're talking about taking our client experience, documenting how clients react to different prompts or whatever, and then basically using that to do research.
Yeah, I mean look, if I can get some research out of it, that would be cool too. But if it also makes an impact, I mean, I should flip that around. First and foremost, on your side, I think you want it to make an impact. If there's research that comes out of it, or quote unquote thought leadership, that's also great.
What about the flip side? Where do you think academia is lagging what's happening in industry?
Like, how much time do we have, right? To me, one of the big things that really stands out is academics study these sort of more frequent decisions, the spending decisions. Sometimes a saving decision isn't as frequent, but it's, are you going to contribute or not? What's your portfolio allocation? What we have very little purchase on is sort of big, transformative decisions. How do consumers and employees and clients make decisions about education? How do they make it about mortgages and how much house to buy and end-of-life decisions and all these big ones? I think academics can only sort of speculate about these things, and advisors have you have all the experience there. And I don't see as much conversation between the academic side and the advisory side on how these sorts of big transformative decisions actually play out. And I would love to know more about that.
Do you have any thoughts on how we as practitioners can get investors, the public, just to think more about the decision as opposed to being on autopilot?
It's funny because the first question I would want to know is, do people want to think about the decision? Or do,
Oh, interesting.
And so I don't know. It's like, this is where I approach a lot of these research questions is like, just because we want to do it, what do people actually want to do? And then you go back to what I was saying earlier about the sort of one size fits all versus the more segmented approach. And my bet, and I would put money on it, is that there's clients who would love to think more about the decision and others who would say, there's so many other things I want to think about. You think about the decision, put me on autopilot. Right?
But I'm saying the decision to work with someone to help you make better decisions, just to get out of the inertia of not making a decision about their financial future.
Sorry, I misunderstood. Which was the decision?
The initial decision to get off of autopilot and work with an independent advisor.
I this is a question that I'm deeply curious about. Because I always think about the advisory world like the medical field, where nobody questions the need to go to a doctor. There's somebody who thinks about health all the time. They know they have some ideas about what may be best for you. And, well, I guess some people question it. But, the majority would say, yeah, that's who I would go to for my advice. And then the financial advisory world is very different, where I'd say, well, I can kind of do this. I know this. And I can talk to my butcher or whoever it is.
Right.
And, so that's not an answer, but more to say it's a question I would
love to know
the answer to, yeah.
Can you describe from the paper the framework that you guys came up with for conceptualizing financial decisions?
Yeah. So again, we are taping this live, and I want to be sure that I don't bore anybody by talking about an academic framework. But I'll do it really quickly. The way we think about a financial decision, and Abby Oded and I went back and forth on this. But if you had a sort of the history of the PowerPoints that we did, it would look ridiculous. But essentially, we boiled it down to there's the consumer. There's the decision itself, and there's the overall context. And then you say all of these things change over the lifespan, from childhood to adolescence to young adulthood to sort of middle age and to the, toward the I'll call it not the end of life, the latter third, if you will. But part of doing that allowed us to then say, let's group the research that's been done and let's figure out where we need to go there. But I particularly like that sort of bucketing of the financial decision-making space.
So within this framework, Hal, where do you think financial advice is most useful?
I would have to think it's at the decision itself, right? But this is a tricky question because if an advisor were to just pay attention to the decision itself, the aspects of the decision, how consumers think about, and this entails, literacy and how people understand interest and so on and so on. But if an advisor were to just focus on that and miss the consumer side and the context side, then it's not that important anymore because they've missed sort of the big picture. So, I would say start with the consumer, but and maybe people know this in the industry, but I think recognizing the interplay between all three parts is what probably is most important there.
Do you think the industry, in simple terms, should go further up the food chain, like away from the product, away from the retirement projections, and go more upstream into the decision process, just in general?
So my take, and I should be careful to say this is just my take, and it's not based on. There's no empirical research I could point to about this, and I would love to sort of do it. Is to say, I'm not sure they need to go sort of away from a product, but my take is that the product itself is table stakes. Like that's
right.
Everybody sort of assumes that. But then to sort of go, I would actually say deeper upstream and deeper downstream. My guess is that that's what gets an edge, from the advisor perspective for certain clients, right? I assume there's somebody who goes there and says, I just want to talk to you about the decision itself and the financial aspects.
So what do you mean by downstream?
So I would say downstream is the consequences that arise from the decisions, right? So call it the more holistic approach. And researchers have been talking about how do we define it? Well-being. What do we mean by that? Purpose, happiness, meaning. the typical topics that are brought up in business schools, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I would argue everybody in the advisory world eventually cares about that, because that's what money is sort of leading to. But to have a better purchase on that and understand those connections from the decision downstream, I think could actually deepen the knowledge that we have about the decision itself and help people, help clients make better decisions.
So knowing what's in the existing literature on this topic, where do you think are the biggest gaps and opportunities for future work?
So I think that we need to know a lot more about decisions across time, right? So a lot of the research is kind of focused on that, the middle of, the middle of the lifespan, and there is some academic work on financial decision making as people get older, but it's not that deep. And of course, you look at what's the average age of clients, and it's older than what academics are studying, right? And so I think we need to know a lot more about that space. I also think that we could really deepen our knowledge about budgeting. And this sounds funny, right? Because I think academics think about budgeting, they think about literally making a budget, and what that entails and who does it and how strict should it be and how flexible should it be. And I've been talking to advisors, you say that's not really how we think about a budget, right? And so and Abby has done some incredible work on budgets along with Chuck Howard, in case folks are interested. But to kind of know what's the actual use case of budgets, it's not just at the lower end of the income spectrum, but at the middle and the sort of mass affluent end, I think that would be really useful to know. And then maybe if I could give one more sort of area for future work, it's how consumers think about insurance. There's a product that we all have. We all think about on some level, and I don't think enough is done right now on that. And in fact, I keep mentioning her, but Abby was so involved, so integral to this. Obviously, she and I have a call later today, the day we're recording this, about what research we might be doing in this space of insurance, because I think there's not enough academic insight there. There's someone that there's someone that earthquake insurance, but not on the financial side.
Can you talk about what kind of questions you'd be wanting to answer on insurance?
I mean, this is there's got to be some low-hanging fruit there, one of which is what's the best way to frame it to get people to, to think about it in ways that make them, more amenable to it when it's something that's right for them, when it's a good fit. I'd also want to understand what are the drawbacks, what are the barriers, right? Where is somebody sort of hesitant to jump in, especially if this is one side of the whole wealth equation. We spend so much time on the accumulation side, researchers do at least, that this is the protection side, and I don't think we know as much about it. So I'd want to know, well, how do I frame it better if it's something that they should be getting?
And how do you know if you're making the right decision around insurance? Are you properly trained, as opposed to the stigma, I don't like life insurance?
Right, exactly. And I mean, so much of that world, right, so much of that world, of course, has been stigmatized by the smaller segment that might not be peddling products that are good for consumers. But then there's so much else that is good, right? But if consumers just hear about that one end, then that automatic sort of visceral reaction, right? I mean, obviously, first and foremost could be don't call it insurance, but eventually you have to, right?
So you mentioned time. I'm curious. We once talked about having a decision journal for decisions you make in financial planning over time and going back and reviewing it. Do you see value in an exercise like that? Yeah, I mean, part of the value of that would be taking some of the emotion away from past decisions, looking into what I've done. I think the value to that, if it's done frequently enough, and I think that I have to stress that, is that you can start to see where there are intersections between, what are the sort of contextual things that have been happening in my life or your client's life that led to certain decisions or certain fears or whatnot, because then you can start to anticipate, look, the context is happening, how should I react to a given decision, or not?
So put more color around the decision, so it's not just the decision, but the environment in which you made
that decision.
I think that's right. Now, of course, this is going to be a function of like how frequently some of the, and we're talking abstractly here,
Yeah.
you know, but how frequently are the decisions being made, right? You know, I know you guys and I, we have talked about this offline about, you know, budgeting, and even the wealthiest clients sometimes can use help there, right? And those could be frequent spending decisions, right? And I might not think I'm spending as much as I am, and then I'd want to look and say, well, what was leading to me going down the path of spending more than I meant to, or something like that, right?
You talk in the paper about the potential impact of generative AI. How do you think that might affect the way people make financial decisions?
Is it like it's a requirement to speak about AI right now, right?
Here this year, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, look, you could look at this from the client side and the firm side, right? I'm really interested in this from the client side. So, you know, one of the things we know from financial decision-making research, and I'm sure many folks have heard of this, maybe not. Almost 10 years ago, there's this great paper by Fernandez and Lynch and others. John Lynch was he was the senior author on it, looking at the impact of financial education, right? And so this sort of depressing finding from that, and I know there's a lot of debate about this, but my read on that paper is that the depressing finding is that financial education has very little to no impact on consumers once you partial out the impact of self-selection. Like the people who want to learn, financial education may be meaningful, but they might have learned anyway. The one case where it seems to really matter is what we call just-in-time education, right? So if you're 20 and you're learning about mortgages, that's not going to matter, but if I'm trying to figure out interest rates and I'm debating different products, that's when I really want to learn about it. So here's where I think generative AI could be so useful. You know, if you sort of couple it with a machine learning approach of saying, what's the digital footprint that's leading to somebody wanting to make one of these, you know, X, Y, or Z decision? Now let's inject that with A, B, or C education, and of course, you know, you can think about the can of worms that this could open up. Who's providing that education? Where's it coming from? And generative AI it's not brilliant, right? It's only based on what else is out there. But if you could have a version of it that's really smart and also recognizes different segments, man, that could be really useful to a consumer in the moment of needing to make a decision. That's at least my take on the consumer side. You guys probably have more to say about it on the firm side.
Well, just think about your book, right? Your future self. What could AI help if you want to be something in 20, 30 years? Tell me, what do I have to do to get there?
And this is where I need to say I finished the book before ChatGPT was the thing, just in case you're wondering. But absolutely. I mean, to think about the possible futures. I'm actually working with some folks at the MIT Media Lab. One of the things, a new project we have, is looking at possible future selves and showing a consumer what those might look like and what that life would be like. And this is really in the sort of nascent stages. I can look at it now and say, imagine even in 2 or 3 years looking back on this, like how, you know, novice this is. Like, but I could imagine really deepening the ability to talk to clients and consumers about what possible future paths would look like.
So do you see a world where it could analyze the information that's out there, the research that's out there, but also analyze you and your profiles, perhaps your social media profiles, to learn about you and the research, and come back with a future self strategy?
I mean, look, to some extent that's already being done. There's a former postdoc from UCLA, Porras Gambata, and he's done this great work using machine learning to say, let's identify sort of, you know, what your preferences might be. He did this in a really specific use case of looking at recommending articles to you, right? And to some extent, I mean, this is what's done. You know, when you go online or Netflix or anything like that, it's recommending content to you based on what other people like you consume, right? And so there's no reason to think that we couldn't do the same thing for life paths, but we balk at it because we say, well, I'm unique. No one's like me. But of course, there's a lot of people. I mean, you guys are literally wearing the same shirt. There's a lot of people like you, right? And so you know, when we start thinking about the use of that sort of technology to make some predictions, I would put a bet that there might be certain consumers who would almost be more willing to take that advice than if somebody like an older person told me, like, here's a good career path for you. What do they know? Oh, well, computer? They know a lot more.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So one of the obvious questions that I think follows from that, given our audience and where we are, is what role do you see for human financial advisors in a world where machine learning and generative AI are able to give some level of advice?
Dead, just done, right? No, I mean, you know what this reminds me of, Ben, is what would it be, 10, 11, I don't know, 12 years ago. I remember when you start to see the rise of robo-advisors. I remember having a very similar conversation on a stage, and somebody said, what role do financial advisors play? And I wasn't so sure then, and then only a few years went by when you realize it's not a role where you're replacing the advisor, but it's complementary, right? I think you look at what some of the firms are doing where you say, well, there's a role for the robo-advisor, and then there's a role for the financial advisor, and that goes from everything from explaining concepts to the emotional side, right? Look, we could come back in 2 years, and I could be wildly wrong, and the emotional intelligence of AI could go through the roof, and I really trust it. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. And I think the right advisor will know how to use the tools in conjunction with that emotional appreciation, or this sort of focus on well-being, and put that sort of combination into place. So I, if anything, see it as almost sharpening, deepening, enhancing. Maybe I'm optimistic, right?
I don't know. We've played with training an AI chatbot on our content, and then it'll spit out answers that have come from past podcast interviews or our written content. So I think the ability to have the information or the content to train an AI is a big part of that whole thing.
Well, I mean, that's right? Like, it's only as good as the input into it, right? And you guys, I can say this, I don't think I'm, kissing up here, but you guys have good content. So if you put that prior content in, it could help generate questions. Maybe you work off of that. Here's another good use case, right? So one of my friends, Todd Rogers, has this new book out. Cameron, I think we were talking about it. Writing for Busy Readers.
It's a great book.
It's an amazing book, right? And it's just all research-backed strategies of how to put communication out there so that people listen, right? Which is like half the battle, right? I mean, and when I think about this, I think the longest emails I ever get are from students who have, don't have an appreciation of how long it takes me to read. And I'm not saying, I'm so important, but it's like, I know that what they're trying to do is be respectful and write a really detailed message. And the most respectful thing they could do is make it really short. And the book goes through all these strategies that Todd and his co-author have sort of determined based on research. Now, he actually trained like a conversational AI agent on the principles from the book, and now I can pop in an email and say, make this better based on the book's principles. Now, I don't release that before people buy the book, because who's going to buy the book? But it's great. I've played around with it, and that's the type of thing where I could say, man, how amazing is that? Now people actually listen to what I'm trying to say to them. If only I could use that at home with my kids, like just filter what I'm. Okay, that was a dumb joke, but we'll keep going.
I have a practical question for you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So what do you think is the best way for a client to work with an advisory firm? I'm looking for advice for both sides of this in terms of cadence of meetings, relationship with technology-enabled support. It strikes me that meeting once or twice a year might not be optimal for effective long-term decision-making.
So here's another case. I don't mean to keep coming back to this, but this would be another case where segments matter. So one of the, I'll get to this question in a second, right? But one of the things that we focused on in our review paper was that so much of the research that's been done thus far really has been on the broader consumer. And there's a great new paper by Chris Bryan and David Yeager where they say, the heterogeneity revolution is coming, which is a great title for a paper that basically says there are different consumers out there. And my MBAs hate it when they ask me a question, I say it depends. And I'll do that now a little bit too, but here's a place where I'd love to know what the data would say on like which clients do best with the once or twice a year meeting, which clients do best with a monthly check-in, whether sometimes it's on email or text or whatever, and sometimes it's in person or whatnot. But I have to think there's color there and individual differences.
How could you find that out?
So like, what would be the what would be the experiment?
Like if you're
I'd
coming in
wanna
as a
run?
client, you and your wife come in as a client, what could we do? Like, or what could the consumer do
Oh, yeah,
to
sure.
understand what works best for them? As
Right.
opposed to just being preference. I'm talking about outcomes, success-driven
and
decision.
I would say here's where behavior would trump any sort of stated preference, right? So I would almost want to start. You could start by asking, how much would you prefer that we contact you? You could ask them that, but another version is you could sort of play around, and if I'm reaching out to have a meeting and they're saying I'm good, that probably tells you something. But if I'm reaching out to have a meeting and there's contact in between those meetings, maybe that's a client that we want to ramp up the meetings for. I mean, this is like at the risk of being labeled a dumb insight, I would question how many people are actually looking at that sort of, I don't know if you want to call it A/B testing or whatnot, to see. I mean, I think I'm like introspecting, and I get a call from my guy every couple of months, and I often I shouldn't say this on air, but sometimes I dodge it because I'm like, I'm good right now. I don't want to do the thing and like look into this, and I know I'm gonna have to, up my life insurance or something like that. And so, but maybe it'd actually be better for me to talk more. I don't know, but that's a behavior where I'm suggesting maybe I don't want to meet as much.
I wonder if there are prompts that advisors can be using to identify when a client is making a transformative decision and engage then.
Look, oh God, Cameron. I think that would be fantastic. Right, look, I mean, we know there's already a model for this, right? I mean, Target did this for years. I mean, they probably still do it. I'm sure big companies do. You know the story about Target using data to identify when someone is pregnant, right? I mean, they're doing it because they know that's a transformative decision. When do people make choices about switching brands or adopting a new brand? It's when they go through that, when they move, when they become a parent, when they go through divorce or marriage or whatever it might be. And that kind of blew up, right, when they sent, the story goes, they sent messages to a teenager and about a new crib and diapers, and the dad said, "Why are you sending this?" And they said, "Well, it's just an algorithm." And then he called back and said, "Actually, the algorithm was right. She's pregnant." And so, I think you don't have enough data. You don't have enough data at a firm, right? The big stores have reams and reams of data, and this is what we mean when we talk about big data analytics, to then make some of those predictions. And they're never perfect, but they're saying better than chance, I can predict if you're going through a big change. I do wonder, though, if that's something that you guys can start picking up on, and maybe you do already, right? As well.
Yeah, we don't now, but I think getting connected to clients' bank accounts, or at least having insight into what's going on at a transactional level, is probably yeah.
I mean, if you told me, look, I would be a skeptic at first if I was a client and said, why do you need access to my credit card account? But if you were to say to me, look, we're going to analyze that, and now maybe you do have the data. If you have enough clients and enough credit card transactions over time, then I can start saying, well, what are some of the patterns that are happening here? And even within client, you might say, I noticed that you have a real ramp up of spending around April. Oh, is that right? Like I could have anticipated December, but April, interesting. Like, why is that? What's happening? Can we plan for that? That's not a transformative jump or life, decision, but it is still something that could be happening with some frequency or enough frequency to speak to it.
So what area of research are you most excited about now in this whole field?
What am I most excited about right now? Some of the stuff that I'm starting to work on, I mentioned the really early stage, looking into insurance. Some of the other stuff I'm really interested in. Nobody ever says I'm really excited about the end of life, but I'm really excited about end of life decisions. How do consumers or clients think about wills? How do they think about advanced directives? What's the conversation? What's the messaging that may work best in those spaces? A couple years ago, some of my students and I partnered with UCLA Health, and we were trying to put out messages out there. This was just in pilot testing, not with real healthcare patients, but just putting messages out there about, what might move the needle when it comes to advanced directives. And nothing nothing was moving the needle. And I think part of the thing there is that that's a space where nobody's going to respond to like a quick message because it's not a quick decision. And so I'd like to better understand like what's the deeper conversation? How can I analyze like the ways that the ebb and flow of that conversation and what predicts whether someone's going to go ahead and make the will that they need to make and also update it over time. And who does that? That's. Can you tell? I'm getting a little excited about that, but that's not something we know a lot about right now, and I'd love to know more about it.
What about decisions in there about how much to donate, for example, like setting up a foundation, giving to kids?
I mean, there's all sorts of questions there about sort of intergenerational connections, right? So you said there's the better to give with a warm hand than a cold one. Yeah. There's the what do I leave to my kids or do I not want to leave to my kids? And that's not just like a simple like I like them or don't. There's research showing that millionaires who make their money are happier than millionaires who inherit it, right? And I'm oversimplifying. That's not to say that if you want a happy kid, don't give them money, of course. But those are decisions they're not ones that we want to think about. People don't want to think about that stuff because it involves so much uncertainty and it involves dying and then conflict between siblings and kids and all that stuff. But if we could try to get more of a framework, in a more systemized way of talking about it. I know we were chatting about that earlier. I think there could be so much value there.
We talked earlier about the connection between industry and academia. What do you think financial advisors should be most excited about in this area of research?
Oh, yeah. Look, one of the things I would love, there's a distinction between what they should be and what I want them to be. I would love them to be, excited about sort of operationalizing concepts, right? And that's a fancy way to say, or not fancy, but maybe that's a too complicated way to say. I think a lot of advisors know about the concepts. Like most advisors now know about System 1 and System 2 thinking and behavioral economics and quantum diversity and all that stuff. But then think about how to put that into practice is something I would love more people to get excited about. But then topic-wise, maybe it's because I just said it, but also, the end-of-life decisions. And also decumulation decisions. That's not something we've talked about much, but I'm doing some work in that space. Suzanne Shu is one of the big sort of proponents of that work over at Cornell. She's my former colleague at UCLA. And I think we don't know that much about when people claim, or we know about when they claim, but what are the sort of thoughts that go into when people claim their Social Security benefits here in the U.S., and then also decisions about how do I sort of decumulate and how much do I spend per year, and those old heuristics may not really do the 4% heuristic may not do the.
Do you have that? You've done that research?
Yes, we have done some of that research, and we have a paper that just came out. This is led by Adam Greenberg over at Bocconi University, looking at what are some of the interventions that can impact people's likelihood to want to claim later, and what are the individual differences that impact those likelihood to claim. But that's all hypothetical because we can't. The Social Security Administration didn't let us change the messages that got sent out to consumers despite us asking them, right? But it wasn't.
So what were the findings, though? What influences how late people take their...
I know we have limited time, so there's a lot that was there, but one of the findings of that paper was to talk about the future spending power of the benefits you could get, and so how much you have and how little you have can make an impact on wanting to claim later. Oh, that's just like a teaser there, right? But we tested like 13 different interventions, and we did it over and over to make sure what we were finding works.
Really interesting.
Super interesting. Hal, this has been awesome. I think you're the perfect guest for this event, live from Huntington Beach at Future Proof.
Thanks so much,
coming.
guys.
Thanks for listening.